Welcome to the Audio Renaissance presentation of Zen and the Samurai, written by Daisetsu Suzuki, adapted for audio and produced by Tony Hutz, and read by Christopher Reed.
Before beginning, I wish to make a brief personal comment on the author and the text. D.T. Suzuki, Japan's foremost authority on Zen Buddhism, and the man who introduced Zen Buddhism to Western readers, died in Tokyo in 1966 at the age of 95. Zen and Japanese culture, the work from which this program is drawn, consists primarily of a series of lectures Suzuki delivered during the 1930s in England and the United States, and should be viewed in its historical context. It was a time when Japan was maintaining armies of occupation in China, Korea, and other parts of the Far East. Initially, Suzuki was a supporter of, and to a certain degree an apologist for, Japanese imperialist expansion. As a spokesman for resurgent Japanese national identity in the early years of the 20th century, he helped to create the idea of Zen Buddhism as an integral aspect of Japanese cultural identity. But it is worth remembering that by the late 1940s, Suzuki had become a pacifist, vocally anti-nuclear, and expressed a wish to revise some of his earlier works on Japanese cultural identity, most especially those concerning the influence of Zen Buddhism on the Japanese martial traditions. Zen and Japanese culture, however, remains as it was originally written. It remains a brilliant and seminal work on Zen Buddhism, from a scholar of immense breadth and depth. It may be considered strange that Zen has in any way been affiliated with the spirit of the military classes of Japan. Whatever form Buddhism takes in the various countries where it flourishes, it is a religion of compassion, and in its varied history it has never been found engaged in warlike activities. How is it, then, that Zen has come to activate the fighting spirit of the Japanese warrior? In Japan, Zen was intimately related from the beginning of its history to the life of the samurai. Although it has never actively incited them to carry on their violent profession, it has passively sustained them when they have, for whatever reason, once entered into it. Zen has sustained them in two ways, morally and philosophically. Morally, because Zen is a religion which teaches us not to look backwards once the course is decided upon. Philosophically, because it treats life and death indifferently. This not turning backward ultimately comes from the philosophical conviction, but being a religion of the will, Zen appeals to the samurai spirit morally rather than philosophically. From the philosophical point of view, Zen upholds intuition against intellection, for intuition is the more direct way of reaching the truth. Therefore, morally and philosophically, there is in Zen a great deal of attraction for the military classes, the military mind being, and this is one of the essential qualities of the fighter, comparatively simple, and not at all addicted to philosophizing, finds a congenial spirit in Zen. This is probably one of the main reasons for the close relationship between Zen and the samurai. Secondly, Zen discipline is simple, direct, self-reliant, and self-denying. Its ascetic tendency goes well with the fighting spirit. The fighter is to be always single-minded with one object in view, to fight, looking neither backward nor sidewise. To go straight forward in order to crush the enemy is all that is necessary for him. He is therefore not to be encumbered in any possible way, be it physical, emotional, or intellectual. Intellectual doubts, if they are cherished at all in the mind of the fighter, are great obstructions to his onward movement, while emotionalities and physical possessions are the heaviest of encumbrances if he wants to conduct himself most efficiently in his vocation. A good fighter is generally an ascetic or stoic, which means he has an iron will. This, when needed, Zen can supply. Thirdly, there is an historical connection between Zen and the military classes of Japan. The 12th century Buddhist priest Eisai is generally regarded as the first to introduce Zen into Japan, but his activities were more or less restricted to Kyoto, which was at the time the headquarters of the older schools of Buddhism. The inauguration of any new faith here was almost impossible owing to the strong opposition they offered. Eisai had to compromise to some extent by assuming a reconciliatory attitude toward the Tendai and the Shingon. Whereas in Kamakura, which was the seat of the Hojo government, there were no such historical difficulties. Besides, the Hojo regime was militaristic, as it succeeded the Minamoto family who had risen against the Taira family and the court nobles. The latter had lost their efficacy as a governing power because of their over-refinement and effeminacy and consequent degeneration. The Hojo regime is noted for its severe frugality and moral discipline, and also for its powerful administrative and militaristic equipments. The directing heads of such a strong governing machine embraced Zen as their spiritual guide, ignoring tradition in the matter of religion. Zen thus could not help but exercise its varied influence in the general cultural life of the Japanese ever since the 13th century and throughout the Ashikaga and even the Tokugawa period. Zen has no special doctrine or philosophy, no set of concepts or intellectual formulas, except that it tries to release one from the bondage of birth and death by means of certain intuitive modes of understanding peculiar to itself. It is therefore extremely flexible in adapting itself to almost any philosophy and moral doctrine as long as its intuitive teaching is not interfered with. It may be found wedded to anarchism or fascism, communism or democracy, atheism or idealism, or any political or economic dogmatism. It is, however, generally animated with a certain revolutionary spirit, and when things come to a deadlock, as they do when we are overloaded with conventionalism, formalism, and other cognate isms, Zen asserts itself and proves to be a destructive force. The spirit of the Kamakura era was in this respect in harmony with the virile spirit of Zen. We have the saying in Japan, the Tendai is for the royal family, the Shingon for the nobility, the Zen for the warrior classes, and the Jodo for the masses. This saying fitly characterizes each sect of Buddhism in Japan. The Tendai and the Shingon are rich in ritualism, and their ceremonies are conducted in a most elaborate and pompous style appropriate to the taste of the refined classes. The Jodo appeals naturally more to plebeian requirements because of the simpleness of its faith and teaching. Besides its direct method of reaching final faith, Zen is a religion of willpower, and willpower is what is urgently needed by the warriors, though it ought to be enlightened by intuition. The first Zen follower of the Hojo family was Tokiyori, who lived from 1227 to 1263, who succeeded his father Yasutoki in the Hojo regency. He invited to Kamakura the Japanese Zen masters in Kyoto, and also some Chinese masters directly from the southern Song, under whom he earnestly devoted himself to the study of Zen. He finally succeeded in mastering it himself, and this fact must have greatly encouraged all his retainers to imitate the example of their master. Wuan, the Chinese Zen master, under whom Tokiyori had his final enlightenment after 21 years of constant application, composed the following verse for his illustrious disciple. I have no Buddhism about which I can this moment talk to you, nor have you any mind with which you listen to me hoping for an attainment. Where there is neither preaching nor attainment nor mind, there Shakyamuni has a most intimate interview with Buddha Dipankara. Before going further, I should mention that in my translations of Japanese poetry, no attempt is made to reproduce the original rhythm. They are mostly literal renderings, with the fewest additions necessary to make the sense somewhat more intelligible to English listeners. After a very successful regency, Tokiyori died in 1263, when he was only 37 years old. When he realized that the time for departure was approaching, he put on his Buddhist robe and sat on a straw seat of meditation. After writing his farewell song, he passed away quietly. The song reads, The karma mirror raised high, these 37 years. 'Tis broken now with one hammer blow. The great way remains ever serene. Hojo Tokimuni, who lived from 1251 to 1284, was his only son, and when his father's mantle fell on him in 1268, he was only 18 years old. He proved to be one of the greatest personages whom Japan has produced. Without him, indeed, the history of the country would not be what it actually is. He it was who most effectively crushed the Mongolian invasions, lasting several years. In fact, during the whole length of his regency, from 1268 to 1284. It seems that Tokimuni was almost a heaven-sent agent to stave off the direst calamity that might have befallen the nation, for he passed away with the termination of the greatest event in the history of Japan. His short life was simply and wholly devoted to this affair. He was then the body and soul of the whole nation. His indomitable spirit controlled the whole situation, and his body, in the form of a most strongly consolidated army, stood like a solid rock against the tumultuously raging waves of the Western Sea. A still more wonderful thing about this almost superhuman figure, however, is that he had time and energy and aspiration to devote himself to the study of Zen under the masters from China. He erected temples for them, especially one for Buko Kokushi, the national teacher, which was meant also to console the departed spirits, both Japanese and Chinese, at the time of the Mongolian invasions. Tokimuni's grave is still in this last-mentioned temple known as Engakuji. Some letters are still preserved, which were sent to him by his several spiritual masters, and from these we know how studiously and vigorously he applied himself to Zen. The following story, though not quite authenticated, gives support to our imaginative reconstruction of his attitude towards Zen. Tokimuni is said to have once asked Buko, "The worst enemy of our life is cowardice, and how can I escape it?" Buko answered, "Cut off the source whence cowardice comes." Tokimuni, "Where does it come from?" Buko, "It comes from Tokimuni himself." Tokimuni, "Above all things, cowardice is what I hate most, and how can it come out of myself?" Buko, "See how you feel when you throw overboard your cherished self known as Tokimuni. I will see you again when you have done that." Tokimuni, "How can this be done?" Buko, "Shut out all your thoughts." Tokimuni, "How can my thoughts be shut out of consciousness?" Buko, "Sit cross-legged in meditation and see into the source of all your thoughts which you imagine as belonging to Tokimuni." Tokimuni, "I have so much of worldly affairs to look after, and it is difficult to find spare moments for meditation." Buko, "Whatever worldly affairs you are engaged in, take them up as occasions for your inner reflection, and someday you will find out who this beloved Tokimuni of yours is." Something like the above must have taken place sometime between Tokimuni and Buko. When he received definite reports about the Mongolian invaders coming over the sea of Tsuxi, he appeared before Buko, the national teacher, and said, "The greatest event of my life is at last here." Buko asked, "How would you face it?" Tokimuni uttered, "Katsu," as if he were frightening away all his enemies actually before him. Buko was pleased and said, "Truly, a lion's child roars like a lion." This was the courage with which Tokimuni faced the overwhelming enemies coming over from the continent and successfully drove them back. Historically speaking, however, it was not courage alone with which Tokimuni accomplished the greatest deed in the history of Japan. He planned everything that was needed for this task, and his ideas were carried out by the armies engaged in the different parts of the country to resist the powerful invaders. He never moved out of Kamakura, but his armies far out in the western parts of Japan executed his orders promptly and effectively. This was extraordinary in those remote days, when there was no speedier method of communication than relay horses. Unless he had the perfect confidence of all his subordinates, it was impossible for him to achieve such a feat. Buko's eulogy of Tokimuni at his funeral ceremony sums up his personality. There were 10 wonders in his life, which was the actualization of a bodhisattva's great pranidhana or vows. He was a filial son to his mother. He was a loyal subject to his emperor. He sincerely looked after the welfare of the people. Studying Zen, he grasped its ultimate truth. Wielding an actual power in the empire for 20 years, he betrayed no signs of joy or anger. Sweeping away by virtue of a gale the threatening clouds raised by the barbarians, he showed no feeling of elation. Establishing the Engakuji monastery, he planned for the spiritual consolation of the dead. Paying homage to the teachers and fathers of Buddhism, he sought for enlightenment. All this proves that his coming among us was solely for the sake of the Dharma. And then when he was about to depart, he managed to rise from his bed, put the Buddhist robe I gave him over his enfeebled body, and write his death song in full possession of his spirit. Such a one as he must be said to be really an enlightened being, or a bodhisattva incarnate." Unquote. Let me make a point about Tokimuni's spiritual consolation of the dead. The Engakuji monastery was a monument both for fallen Japanese and Mongolian warriors. The idea that both friends and enemies, when dead, are to be equally treated with respect originated with Buddhism. For it teaches that we are all of the same Buddha nature, and while living in this world of particulars, may espouse a variety of causes and principles. But these controversies vanish when we pass from these individual existences to the other shore of transcendental wisdom. From the samurai point of view, the idea of loyalty and sincerity is emphasized more than anything else. Enemies are as faithful to their cause as we are to ours, and this sentiment, when genuine, is to be revered wherever and however displayed. Hence, one monument dedicated to the spirits of friends and foes. Tokimuni was born great, no doubt, but his study of Zen must have helped him a great deal in his dealing with state affairs and also in his private life. His wife was also a devout Zen follower, and after his death she founded a nunnery in the hills just opposite the Engakuji. When we say that Zen is for the warrior, this statement has a particular significance for the Kamakura period. Tokimuni was not merely a fighting general, but a great statesman whose object was peace. His prayer offered to the Buddha at the time of a great religious ceremony, performed at the Kenshoji under the leadership of the abbot, when an intimation of the first Mongolian invasion was received, runs as follows. The only prayer Tokimuni, a Buddhist disciple, cherishes is that the imperial house continue in prosperity, that for a long time to come the emperor may be the guardian of the Buddha's doctrine, that the four seas remain unruffled without an arrow being shot, that all evil spirits be kept under subjection without a spearhead being unsheathed, that the masses be benefited by means of a benevolent administration, so that they could enjoy a long life in happiness more than ever, that the darkness of the human mind be illumined by the torch of transcendental wisdom, which should be raised high, that the needy be properly ministered to, and those in danger be saved by the heart of compassion being widely open. May all the gods come and protect us, all the sages extending their quiet help, and every hour of the day may there be a great gathering of auspicious signs." Unquote. Tokimuni was a great Buddhist spirit and a sincere follower of Zen, and it was due to his encouragement that Zen came to be firmly established in Kamakura, and then in Kyoto, and began to spread its moral and spiritual influence among the warrior classes. The constant stream of intercourse thus started between the Japanese and the Chinese Zen monks went even beyond the boundaries of their common cause. Books, paintings, porcelains, potteries, textiles, and many other objects of art were brought from China. Even carpenters, masons, architects, and cooks came along with their masters. Thus, the trading with China that later developed in the Ashikaga period had its initiation in the Kamakura. Led by such strong characters as Tokiori and Tokimuni, Zen was auspiciously introduced into the Japanese life, especially into the life of the samurai. As Zen gained more and more influence in Kamakura, it spread over to Kyoto, where it was strongly supported by Japanese Zen masters. The latter soon found strong followers among members of the imperial family, headed by the emperors Go-Daigo, Hanazono, and others. Large monasteries were built in Kyoto, and masters noted for their virtue, wisdom, and learning were asked to be founders and successive abbots of such institutions. Shoguns of the Ashikaga regime were also great advocates of Zen Buddhism, and most generals under them naturally followed suit, In those days we can say that the Japanese genius went either to priesthood or to soldiery. The spiritual cooperation of the two great professions could not help but contribute to the creation of what is now generally known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. At this juncture, let me touch upon one of the inner relationships that exist between the samurai mode of feeling and Zen. What finally has come to constitute Bushido as we generally understand it now is the act of being an unflinching guardian god of the dignity of the samurai, and this dignity consists in loyalty, filial piety, and benevolence. But to fulfill these duties successfully, two things are needed: to train oneself in moral asceticism, not only in its practical aspect, but in its philosophical preparation, and to be always ready to face death, that is, to sacrifice oneself unhesitatingly when occasion arises. To do this, much mental and spiritual training is needed. There is a document that was very much talked about in connection with the Japanese military operations in China in the 1930s. It is known as the Hagakure, which literally means hidden under the leaves, for it is one of the virtues of the samurai not to display himself, not to blow his horn, but to keep himself away from the public eye and be doing good for his fellow beings. To the compilation of this book, which consists of various notes, anecdotes, moral sayings, etc., a Zen monk had his part to contribute. The work started in the middle part of the 17th century under Nabeshima Naoshige, the feudal lord of Saga in the island of Kyushu. The book emphasizes very much the samurai's readiness to give his life away at any moment, for it states that no great work has ever been accomplished without going mad. That is, when expressed in modern terms, without breaking through the ordinary level of consciousness and letting loose the hidden powers lying further below. These powers may be devilish sometimes, but there is no doubt that they are superhuman and work wonders. When the unconscious is tapped, it rises above individual limitations. Death now loses its sting altogether, and this is where the samurai training joins hands with Zen. To quote one of the stories cited in the Hagakure, Yagju Tajima no Kame Munenori was a great swordsman and the teacher in the art of the shogun of the time, Tokugawa Iemitsu. One of the personal guards of the shogun one day came to Tajima no Kame wishing to be trained in swordplay. The master said, "As I observe, you seem to be a master of the art yourself. Pray tell me to what school you belong, before we enter into the relationship of teacher and pupil." The guardsman said, "I am ashamed to confess that I have never learned the art." "Are you going to fool me? I am teacher to the honorable shogun himself, and I know my judging eye never fails." "I am sorry to defy your honor, but I really know nothing." This resolute denial on the part of the visitor made the swordsmaster think for a while, and he finally said, "If you say so, that must be so, but still I am sure of your being master of something, though I know not just what." "Yes, if you insist, I will tell you this. There is one thing of which I can say I am complete master. When I was still a boy, the thought came upon me that as a samurai I ought in no circumstances to be afraid of death. And ever since I have grappled with the problem of death now for some years, and finally the problem has entirely ceased to worry me. May this be what you hint at?" "Exactly," exclaimed Tajima no Kame. "That is what I mean. I am glad I made no mistake in my judgment. For the ultimate secrets of swordsmanship also lie in being released from the thought of death. I have trained ever so many hundreds of my pupils along this line, but so far none of them really deserve the final certificate of swordsmanship. You need no technical training. You are already a master." The problem of death is a great problem with every one of us. It is, however, more pressing for the samurai, for the soldier, whose life is exclusively devoted to fighting, and fighting means death to fighters of either side. In feudal days nobody could predict when this deadly encounter might take place, and the samurai worth his name was always to be on the alert. A warrior writer of the 17th century, Daidoji Yusan, therefore writes in the beginning of his book called A Primer of Bushido as follows: The idea most vital and essential to the samurai is that of death, which he ought to have before his mind day and night, night and day, from the dawn of the first day of the year till the last minute of the last day of it. When this notion takes firm hold of you, you are able to discharge your duties to their fullest extent. You are loyal to your master, filial to your parents, and naturally can avoid all kinds of disasters. Not only is your life itself thereby prolonged, but your personal dignity is enhanced. Think what a frail thing life is, especially that of a samurai. This being so, you will come to consider every day of your life your last, and dedicate it to the fulfillment of your obligations. Never let the thought of a long life seize upon you, for then you are apt to indulge in all kinds of dissipation and end your days in dire disgrace. This was the reason why Masashige is said to have told his son Masatsura to keep the idea of death all the time before his mind." Unquote. The writer of this primer has rightly given expression to what has been unconsciously going on in the mind of the samurai generally. The notion of death, on the one hand, makes one's thoughts extend beyond the limitations of this finite life, and, on the other hand, screws it up so as to take daily life seriously. It was, therefore, natural for every sober-minded samurai to approach Zen with the idea of mastering death. Zen's claim to handle this problem without appealing either to learning or to moral training or to ritualism must have been a great attraction to the comparatively unsophisticated mind of the samurai. There was a kind of logical relationship between his psychological outlook and the direct practical teaching of Zen. Further, we read the following in the Hagakure. Bushido means the determined will to die. When you are at the parting of the ways, do not hesitate to choose the way to death. No special reason for this except that your mind is thus made up and ready to see to the business. Some may say that if you die without attaining the object, it is a useless death, dying like a dog. But when you are at the parting of the ways, you need not plan for attaining the object. We all prefer life to death, and our planning and reasoning will be naturally for life. If then you miss the object and are alive, you are really a coward. This is an important consideration. In case you die without achieving the object, it may be a dog death, the deed of madness. But there is no reflection here on your honor. In Bushido, honor comes first. Therefore, every morning and every evening have the idea of death vividly impressed in your mind. When your determination to die at any moment is thoroughly established, you attain to perfect mastery of Bushido. Your life will be faultless, and your duties will be fully discharged." Unquote. A commentator adds a verse by Tsukahara Bokuden, a great swordsman of the 16th century. For the samurai to learn, there's one thing only, one last thing, to face death unflinchingly. According to Nagahame Inosuke, as told in the Hagakure, the essence of swordsmanship consists in giving yourself up altogether to the business of striking down the opponent. As long as you are concerned about your own safety, you can never win in the fight. If the enemy, too, is ready to give his life to it, you are then well matched. The final outcome will depend on faith and fate. The commentary note on this reads, Araki Matayemon, a great swordsman of the early Tokugawa era, gave this instruction to his nephew, Watanabe Kazuma, when they were about to engage in the deadly fight with their enemy. Let the enemy touch your skin and you cut into his flesh. Let him cut into your flesh and you pierce into his bones. Let him pierce into your bones and you take his life. In another place, Araki advises, when you are to measure swords with your enemy, be ready at all times to lay down your life before him. As long as you are in the least concerned with your escaping safely, you are doomed. Inasmuch as Tsukahara Bokuden was mentioned just now as one of those swordsmen who really understood the mission of the sword, not as a weapon of murder, but as an instrument of spiritual self-discipline, Let me mention here the two best-known incidents in his life. When Bokuden was crossing Lake Biwa in a rowboat with a number of passengers, there was among them a rough-looking samurai, stalwart and arrogant in every possible way. He boasted of his skill in swordsmanship, saying that he was the foremost man in the art. The fellow passengers were eagerly listening to his blatant talk, while Bokuden was dozing as if nothing were going on about him. This irritated the braggart very much. He approached Bokuden and shook him, saying, "You also carry a pair of swords. Why not say a word?" Answered Bokuden quietly, "My art is different from yours. It consists not in defeating others, but in not being defeated." This incensed the fellow immensely. "What is your school, then?" "Mine is known as the Mutekatsu school. This means to defeat the enemy without hands, that is, without using a sword." "Why then do you yourself carry a sword?" "This is meant to do away with selfish motives, and not to kill others." The man's anger now knew no bounds, and he exclaimed in a most impassioned manner, "Do you really mean to fight me with no swords?" "Why not?" was Bokuden's answer. The braggart samurai called out to the boatman to row toward the nearest land. But Bokuden suggested that it would be better to row to the island further off, because the mainland might attract people who were liable to get somehow hurt. The samurai agreed. The boat headed toward the solitary island at some distance. As soon as they were near enough, the man jumped off the boat, and drawing his sword, was all ready for a combat. Bokuden leisurely took off his own swords and handed them to the boatman. To all appearances, he was about to follow the samurai onto the island, when Bokuden suddenly took the oar away from the boatman, and pushing it against the land, gave a hard backstroke to the boat. Thereupon the boat made a precipitous departure from the island, and plunged into the deeper water safely away from the man. Bokuden smilingly remarked, "This is my no-sword school." Another interesting and instructive anecdote is told of how Bokuden's mastery of the art really went beyond merely acquiring proficiency in swordplay. He had 3 sons who were all trained in swordsmanship. He wanted to test their attainments. He placed a little pillow over the curtain at the entrance of his room, and it was so arranged that a slight touch of the curtain, when it was raised upon entering, would make the pillow fall right on one's head. Bokuden called in the eldest son first. When he approached, he noticed the pillow on the curtain, so he took it down, and after entering, he placed it back in the original position. The second son was now called in. He touched the curtain to raise it, and as soon as he saw the pillow coming down, he caught it in his hands and carefully put it back where it had been. It was the third son's turn to touch the curtain. He came in brusquely, and the pillow fell right on his neck, but he cut it in 2 with his sword even before it came down on the floor. Bokuden passed his judgment. "Eldest son, you are well qualified for swordsmanship." So saying, he gave him a sword. To the second son he said, "Train yourself yet assiduously." But the youngest son Bokuden most severely reproved, for he was pronounced to be a disgrace to his family. Takeda Shingen and Uesugi Kenshin were 2 great generals of the 16th century, when Japan was in a state of war within its own boundaries. The 2 are generally mentioned together, for their provinces, the one in the north and the other in central Japan, lay close together, and they had on several occasions to fight for supremacy. They were well matched as able soldiers and good rulers, and they were also students of Zen. When Kenshin once learned that Shingen was suffering very much from lack of salt for his people, he supplied his enemy from his own province, which, facing the Japan Sea, produced enough salt. In one of the pitched battles at Kawanakajima, Kenshin grew impatient, it is said, at the slow progress of his army, and wishing to decide at once the fate of the day, he personally rode into the camp of Shingen. Seeing the general of the opposing force quietly sitting on a camp chair with a few of his guards, Kenshin drew his sword and let it fall squarely over the head of Shingen, saying, "What would you say at this moment?" A usual Zen question. Shingen was not disturbed at all, answering, "A snowflake on the blazing stove." He warded off the threatening weapon with an iron fan which was at the time in his hand. The mondo, a form of question and answer, probably never took place, but the story well illustrates how the two intrepid head-shaven warriors were Zen men. The way Kenshin came to study Zen in full earnest under Yakiwo was thus. When Yakiwo once gave his sermon on Bodhidharmas, I know not, Kenshin was among the audience. He knew something of Zen and wished to test this monk. He appeared in the dress of an ordinary samurai, indistinguishable from the rest, and waited for the opportunity, but the monk suddenly turned toward Kenshin and demanded, "O Lord General, what is the meaning of Dharmas, I know not?" Kenshin was taken by surprise and did not know what to say. Thereupon Yakiwo continued, "O Lord General, why not give me an answer today, when you talk so glibly about Zen on all other occasions?" Kenshin's pride gave way. He now began to study Zen most seriously under the leadership of this monk, who used to tell him, "If you are really desirous of mastering Zen, it is necessary for you once to give up your life and to plunge right into the pit of death." Kenshin later left the following admonition for his retainers. "Those who cling to life die, and those who defy death live. The essential thing is the mind. Look into this mind and firmly take hold of it, and you will understand that there is something in you which is above birth and death, and which is neither drowned in water nor burned by fire. I have myself gained an insight into this samadhi, and know what I am telling you. Those who are reluctant to give up their lives and embrace death are not true warriors." Unquote. Shingen also made reference to Zen and death in his constitution, this way. Pay proper reverence to the gods and the Buddha. When your thoughts are in accord with the Buddha's, you will gain more power. If your domination over others issues from your evil thoughts, you will be exposed. You are doomed. Next, devote yourself to the study of Zen. Zen has no secrets other than seriously thinking about birth and death. From these statements, we can see unmistakably that there is an inner necessary relationship between Zen and the warrior's life. This is readily explained also from the behavior of the Zen masters themselves, who sometimes even seem to make sport of death. Shingen's Zen teacher was Kwaisen, abbot of Yerinji, in the province of Kai. After Shingen's death, the monastery was besieged by the soldiers of Oda Nobunaga on the 3rd of April, 1582, because the abbot refused to give up Nobunaga's enemies who had taken refuge in it. The soldiers forced all the monks, including Kwaisen himself, to go up to the top story of the monastery gate. The plan was to burn the recalcitrants alive by setting the whole edifice on fire. The monks headed by the abbot quietly gathered and sat cross-legged, taking their seats in due order in front of the Buddha image. The abbot gave his last sermon in his usual manner, saying, "We are now encircled by the flames. And how would you revolve your wheel of the Dharma at this critical moment? Let each one of you say a word." Thereupon each expressed himself according to his light of understanding. When all were finished, the abbot gave his view and all entered into the fire samadhi. The abbot's words were these: "For a peaceful meditation, we need not to go to the mountains and streams. When thoughts are quieted down, fire itself is cool and refreshing." The Japan of the 16th century, from a certain point of view, produced many fine specimens of humanity. The country was torn to pieces, as it were, politically and socially. All over Japan the feudal lords were at war with one another. The masses must have suffered very much, but this deadly competition for military and political supremacy among the soldier classes helped to strain the mental and moral powers to the utmost in every possible way. Virility asserted itself in various departments of life. We can say that most of the virtues composing Bushido were formed in this period, and that Shingen and Kenshin were typical representatives of the samurai lords. They both were personally brave and never flinched in the face of death. They were wise and thoughtful and resourceful not only in war, but in governing the people under them. They were not merely fighters, ignorant and callous. They were accomplished in literature and highly religious. It is interesting that both Shingen and Kenshin were great Buddhists. Shingen's secular name is Harunobu, and Kenshin's Terutora, but they are better known by their Buddhist titles. They were both educated in youth at Buddhist monasteries, and they had their heads shaven in their middle years, calling themselves Nyudo of Buddhism, which literally means entering the path, that is, the spiritual path or the Buddhist life. Kenshin was a celibate and a vegetarian, like the Buddhist monks. Like most Japanese of culture, they loved nature and composed poems both in Japanese and in Chinese. One of the poems Kenshin wrote while engaged in a campaign in the neighboring provinces reads in substance, "The bracing, frosty autumnal air descends upon the soldiers in bivouac. The night is advancing. The wild geese in orderly formation are seen flying in the moonlight. The mountains of Ekchu are silhouetted over against the dreamy waves of Noto Bay. What a splendid view this is, and how entranced I am, albeit that we are far away from the people at home, who may be thinking of our expedition beneath the same moonlight." Shingen's appreciation of nature was by no means inferior to that of his rival in Echigo. When he once visited a Buddhist temple in the remoter part of his province, where the god Fudo-Myu, also called Achala Vidyaraja, was enshrined, the abbot of a monastery nearby requested him to pass by it on his way home. Shingen first declined the invitation, saying that he was busily preparing for a campaign taking place in a few days, and would not have time to call on the abbot just now. He added that when he came back from the engagement, he would surely visit the monastery. But the abbot, who, by the way, was the one who later allowed himself to be burned alive in the hands of Oda Nobunaga's soldiers, insisted. "The cherries are just beginning to bloom, and I have already set up a fine seat for you where you can enjoy the glorious spring. I hope you will not fail to appreciate the flowers." Shingen acquiesced, saying, "It would not do to set my face against the cherries, and then I ought also to mind the pressing invitation of the abbot." In appreciation of the fine opportunity to enjoy the flowers and an unworldly conversation with the abbot, Shingen composed the following verse in Japanese. "If I had not had this invitation from my friend, how greatly I should have missed this magnificent sight of the cherry blossoms. The monastery might be found all swathed in snow next spring when I propose to visit it." I should mention that the love of the cherry blossoms among the Japanese seems to be their second nature. There was once, in the Koishikawa dungeon, in the days of the Tokugawa regime, a woman prisoner who was destined to be executed before the spring. She used to look out from her window, and observing a cherry tree, she wished to see it in bloom. When the sentence was given, she expressed her intense desire to see the tree in bloom before she parted forever from this earth. The jailer was a kind-hearted man, who granted her her last wish. It is said that the woman met her death in the happiest spirit. The cherry came to be known by her name, Asatsuma.